on the BBC Weather app.
We're going to start with
what's happening when it comes to climate change.
We cannot normalize this.
This is going to appeal to more people than just his base.
and that's really the nub of this. The hard part comes next.
That gift of panda diplomacy.
But this is the first time we've done this in modern history.
And we're going to say unprecedented a lot.
The news is just words without the context.
And this is the context.
Tomorrow from 8 on BBC News and iPlayer.
Tonight at 10, Ukraine blows up a key bridge in Russia used by Moscow to supply its troops as part of its cross-border incursion. Kyiv releases images from the start of its offensive 11 days ago, an attack on a Russian border checkpoint.
This is the main route from Ukraine's Sumy region into Russia itself. You have to imagine it as an artery. And as advances start to slow, the question becomes, what next?
Also tonight, the longest sentences yet for two men who took part in riots in England. One gets nearly 5 years, the other 6. Victims of the infected blood scandal will get compensation payments by the end of the year, more than £2 million for some. And as Manchester United and Fulham kick off the new Premier League season, we'll be looking at issues facing clubs on and off the pitch.
And stay with us here on BBC News for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
Good evening. Ukraine has destroyed a strategic river bridge in the Kursk region of Russia as it continues its incursion into Russian territory, cutting a supply route. Kyiv says the aim of its offensive is to force Moscow to start what it calls fair peace talks. Meanwhile, Russia has summoned Italy's ambassador in Moscow over a team of Italian journalists who reported from Ukrainian-held parts of Russia this week, calling it an illegal border crossing. On the 11th day of Ukraine's offensive, its military released footage of the start of their assault on a Russian border checkpoint in the Kursk region. Let's go live now to our Ukraine correspondent, James Waterhouse, who's near the border with Russia. James.
Reeta, broadly, this is about, and you sense this here, this is about Ukraine creating a finish line to this war that it just might be able to accept. But of course, there are military benefits too to this counter-offensive. It is creating a buffer zone on the border. It is capturing hundreds of Russian soldiers, which will give it leverage in future prisoner of war negotiations. And tonight, confirmation that it is also targeting the logistical routes feeding Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Ukraine isn't just targeting Russian troops, but their supply lines too. A missile makes light work of a major bridge in Russia's Kursk region. It was a counter-offensive which surprised just about everyone. Apart from the Ukrainian paratroopers who've released this footage, complete with dramatic music and muscular armour from when they first overwhelmed a Russian border crossing, and the soldiers manning it. After a blistering land grab in the Kursk region, Ukraine's gains are starting to slow. Russia is diverting resources like these artillery units to stem the tide. Nevertheless, Ukraine is bringing in more troops to consolidate what it's taken.
This is the main route from Ukraine's Sumy region into Russia itself. You have to imagine it as an artery. And as advances start to slow, the question becomes, what next? Kyiv took this territory with relative ease, with the element of surprise and elite forces. But keeping hold of it as Russia turns its head and redeploys thousands of troops, well, that will be very different.
Arnie signed up to defend Ukraine with the full-scale invasion.
No one likes war. We want to finish it. I'm not keen to fight, but for our Ukraine, for our people, we'll stand till the end.
Anatoly has just returned from Russian soil and has noticed a difference in progress.
We are still advancing. It's slowed down a bit, but we're moving forward. As long as we have orders and instructions, we'll keep on moving.
Anatoly hopes his efforts will relieve pressure on other parts of the front line. As of yet, that's not happening. Regardless, Ukraine's goal seems to be shifting from liberation to producing bargaining chips for a future peace deal, whenever that might be.
The general behind this operation, Alexander Syrsky, was also behind Ukraine's counter-offensives of 2022, where Ukraine succeeded through misdirection and surprise. Things went south when the war became static and bogged down, and Kyiv will be hoping that doesn't happen in 2024. They will want to keep things moving for as long as possible.
Thank you very much. James Waterhouse reporting there. Here, 2 men have received the longest jail sentences yet for their roles in the riots that swept parts of England and Northern Ireland after the Southport stabbings. One was jailed for 6 years, the other for almost 5 years after riots in Hull. Will Vernon reports.
12 hours of racist, hate-fuelled mob violence. That was how a judge described the unrest on the streets of Hull on the 3rd of August. The man in the England flag, 25-year-old John Honey, one of 2 men convicted today of violent disorder and racially aggravated criminal damage. Honey, on the left, was sentenced to 4 years, 8 months in prison. David Wilkinson got 6 years, the longest sentences so far. They were part of this ferocious attack on a car. Inside were 3 terrified Romanian men who managed to escape. John Honey also broke into a Lush cosmetics shop and looted it. He then handed out the items he'd stolen to people outside. Also sentenced today, this man, Roger Hayward, arrested at a riot in Blackpool. He was given 2.5 years in prison for violent disorder and 2 counts of assaulting an emergency worker. Hayward was an instigator of the riots, according to the judge, who said communities in Britain had been grieving peacefully in the wake of the tragic events in Southport.
Whereas others, such as you, decided to usurp this terrible incident as an excuse for mindless, drunken thuggery.
Prosecutors say they now plan to give more people the harsher charge of rioting. That carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. Will Vernon, BBC News.
The family of a yoga teacher who was stabbed during the Southport knife attack say that she's been readmitted to hospital due to breathing problems. Leanne Lucas is believed to have been one of the organisers of the Taylor Swift-themed dance class where the attack, which left 3 girls dead, took place. Compensation payments to victims of the infected blood scandal will be made, the government has said, retaining the scheme announced in May by the previous government after a report by the public inquiry. Between 1970 and 1991, more than 30,000 people were infected with HIV and hepatitis C from contaminated blood products and transfusions. More than 3,000 of them have since died, many of them haemophiliacs who were given infected products as part of their treatment. The size of the payouts will depend on individual circumstances, but many could be looking at compensation of more than £2 million. Our health editor Hugh Pym explains.
Victims of the infected blood scandal, some who campaigned for decades, others who didn't survive. A public inquiry found they'd been consistently failed by those in authority. Today, ministers have firmed up details of the official compensation scheme announced by the previous government. It's been widely welcomed.
What is decent compensation? That's difficult to say.
But some like Gary aren't happy. He was a pupil at Treelaw School in Hampshire and infected with HIV and hepatitis C during his treatment for haemophilia. He didn't know he was part of a medical trial, in his own words, a guinea pig. Because of that, he qualifies for an extra amount on top of his compensation, £15,000, with £10,000 going to other haemophiliacs caught up in unethical research. He says neither amount is enough.
£15,000 for a life doesn't seem right. You know, £10,000. Some of these boys were on trials for years and years. Me, myself, a lot of my friends, and we're all very unhappy and insulted by the figures.
There are different levels of compensation depending on the severity of the infections. Jo is disappointed that the maximum award for those like her who contracted hepatitis C is less than what's potentially available to victims of HIV. She was infected during a blood transfusion after giving birth.
We were all given the same blood. We were all given bad blood products. We're all terrified. HIV, hepatitis C, treat us the same, level it out, bring us up. Bring us up. Why are we being treated so differently?
I put some of these concerns to the minister heading the government's response on compensation. The hepatitis C community feel that the potential maximum payments for them are a lot less than for HIV. They're just wondering why.
What I would say, first of all, is we're trying to be fair across the different groups, whether it's infected and indeed the affected, and that's the objective of the government. Secondly, what I would say is that we are basing those tariffs on clinical expert advice.
The minister wants to get the scheme running as quickly as possible so the infected start getting payments by the end of this year and sometime next year for those affected because of the loss of loved ones. Some campaigners, meanwhile, will continue to question details and press for improvements. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
President Biden says a ceasefire in Gaza is much closer than it's ever been, but that it's not there yet. Negotiators will meet again next week to try to finalise an agreement between Israel and Hamas for a ceasefire and also the release of hostages. It comes after the funeral of a 22-year-old Palestinian man shot dead when Jewish settlers stormed his village last night. The attack took place in Jit in the north of the occupied West Bank and was condemned by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Our Middle East correspondent Lucy Williamson reports.
No one knows who made Rashid as-Sidi a village hero, who shot the young IT worker as he threw stones to keep armed Jewish settlers at bay. But they know who to blame.
Even the ambulance that came for him was blocked by the army. They waited until he died. The blame is more on the army because they are not controlling the settlers, they protect them.
His mother said she didn't know if it was a settler or a soldier who fired the fatal shot. Rashid's brother Mahdi took me to where he was killed. The village boundary fence, broken in several places. A neighbour said dozens of settlers gathered here last night and that he heard a hail of gunshots. He said he called the Israeli army, who took 2 hours to arrive. The army said they deployed within minutes. Residents say the settlers were masked, armed and organised into groups, some dressed all in black, some all in white. Hassan was at home with his family when they came down this road. His surveillance camera caught the moment they confronted him, setting fire to his car and entering his family compound.
They were all armed, with automatic weapons, light weapons, pepper spray. Their attack was organised. They had a clear goal to kill or burn. Here we are, unarmed. They have the government supporting them. We have nothing except ourselves.
Israel is under fierce international scrutiny over settler violence in the West Bank. Israel's army says it has launched a thorough investigation into last night's attack. Those gathered for Rashid's funeral prayers had little faith in justice.
The body of Rashid as-Sidi is leading a procession of anger through the village of Jit. People here trace this violence right back to the behaviour of Israeli security forces and the policies of Israeli politicians.
A Palestinian village surrounded by Israeli settlements, distrustful of Israeli forces, burying their anger along with their grief.
Let's join Lucy in Jerusalem just now. And Lucy, there are ceasefire talks underway. What's the latest on those?
Well, we've heard that the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, will be travelling here on Sunday to give a push to those ceasefire talks. And that comes after the release of a joint statement from the international mediators who are leading this process, including the US. They've described the talks over the last couple of days as serious and constructive, said they were taking place in a positive atmosphere. But it's not clear exactly what substantive detail has been agreed. What is clear is that there's enormous international pressure on both sides to go the extra mile this time and sign a deal.
Lucy, thank you. Lucy Williamson there. Here, an inquest has found that a 13-year-old girl died after drinking a hot chocolate because Costa Coffee failed to follow its allergy process properly. Hannah Jacobs had lived with allergies since she was a baby, and the coroner said there'd also been a failure of communication between the coffee shop staff and the teenager's mother.
Hannah was just entering adolescence and learning to be independent, taking ownership of her allergies when she was tragically taken from us. Having heard all the evidence over the last week, it is clear to me that although the food service industry and medical professionals are required to have allergy training, the training is really not taken seriously enough.
People are being urged to consider getting vaccinated against Mpox, formerly known as monkeypox, if they're travelling to affected areas in Africa. The advice from the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control is in response to the outbreak of a highly infectious new strain of the virus. Sweden earlier confirmed that it had detected the first case of the variant outside Africa. Here's our medical editor Fergus Walsh with more.
The Mpox outbreak, centred in the Democratic Republic of Congo, has led to more than 16,000 confirmed cases and more than 500 deaths this year. There's particular concern about a new type of the virus known as Clade 1b, which appears to be more virulent and infectious than the one which caused a public health emergency 2 years ago. Mpox spreads through close physical contact, including from sex or from touching bedding used by someone infected. It can also spread through coughs and sneezes. Children under 15 are most at risk in the outbreak in Central Africa, which health officials think may be partly due to high rates of malnourishment and weaker immune systems. In the last global outbreak in 2022, most cases outside Africa were among gay and bisexual men.
With this particular variant that we are seeing now, the risk of dying from it, the risk of having a severe illness is much, much higher than the one we saw in 2022.
The early symptoms can be like flu, including fever, chills and muscle aches. These are typically followed by a rash which turns into raised spots which fill with blisters and then form scabs. It usually clears up in 2 to 3 weeks, but in a small proportion of cases it can prove fatal, especially in vulnerable children in Africa. Vaccines against smallpox are thought to prevent or reduce the severity of Mpox because the viruses are quite similar, but there's a shortage of doses in the most affected countries. It is offered in the UK to those at highest risk. Health officials say the likelihood of sustained transmission outside Africa remains low.
Fergus Walsh reporting there. Kamala Harris has been outlining her economic programme ahead of the US presidential election. The Vice President, who's the only Democrat contender for the White House, told supporters in North Carolina that she wanted to focus on the middle class and planned to introduce a new child tax credit, cut taxes for families and lower the cost of prescription drugs. A mass brawl has broken out in the Turkish parliament after lawmakers came to blows during a debate on the imprisonment of an opposition politician. The scuffle was over the case of an opposition figure currently in jail for 18 years for his role in anti-government protests in 2013. The fight broke out between his supporters and members of the AK ruling party. The woman accused of supplying the former star of Friends, Matthew Perry, with the drug that led to his death, has been remanded in custody in Los Angeles. Jasveen Sangha, nicknamed the Ketamine Queen by US prosecutors, pleaded not guilty and was denied bail. The 41-year-old, who has both British and American citizenship, is one of 5 people, including 2 doctors, who've been charged in connection with the actor's death. Here, knife-related crime involving children has risen sharply, with the latest government figures showing 18,500 people were sentenced or cautioned for knife and weapons offences in the year to March. In Bristol, a specialist police unit has been set up to try to tackle the issue. Our correspondent Dan Johnson joined them and witnessed the deadly weapons being confiscated from teenagers.
That's the car, the grey one.
Yeah, go for it, that one.
You're about to see the sort of weapons carried by some young people. The grey car, full of teenagers, has refused to stop for police.
Stay where you are! Stay where you are, all of you! Get your hands out now! Weapon out! Weapon found! Everyone hands where we can see them!
Well, that's come from inside the vehicle.
There's a girl
Hop out the car, love. Okay.
and 4 young men, all between 16 and 18.
It's 11:30 on a Wednesday morning. Officers have just stopped this car in a Bristol suburb. They have searched it and retrieved these enormous knives.
No one's out with balaclavas and zombie knives with good intentions, are they?
So do you think stopping them today, seizing those knives, could have really stopped something more serious?
Absolutely, yeah. That's the whole point in doing this. There is no upside, no one wins. And then that poor decision, in a split second, can ruin the rest of their life. It could ruin the rest of the other person's life.
Here's one life lost at 19. Nobody's been charged with stabbing Eddie Knuthia last summer, despite arrests. So his family's left with his last desperate moments, bleeding to death on the street in the arms of his mother.
And when I got there and I saw him, the look on his face of like just shock, like just that panicked look on his face. I kept telling him to stay awake, and he tried. He really tried, because I kept telling him help is coming. You know, the thing that I struggle most with is wanting to go back, if we can do it again.
And there's grief across this city after a surge of teenage knife crime costing young lives in both blood and prison sentences.
Good morning. So we'll talk about the children that are linked to the murder of Darian Williams.
And this is the team sworn to protect young people from a life of violence and the criminal exploitation so often behind it.
What do you say to the people who may be a bit more, look, these kids know what they're getting into?
I think it is really important to understand each individual person, because we don't know what's happened in that child's life. Because actually putting a child in prison is not the answer. It's not the solution, because they'll come out of prison. So what then?
Try and push that one down. Is that all right?
This is mostly about teenage boys as victims or perpetrators, sometimes both. But here, they know it starts so much younger.
There's as young as 6 or 7 year olds carrying knives, and I think fear is the main factor. When you think of a 7, 8 year old, you think of a young person who's got innocence. At the moment, we're seeing young people losing that innocence from such a young age.
Whether they take to the saddle or the barber's seat, here, open, honest conversations are encouraged.
But what makes you not want to be able to go out?
I just don't feel safe outside.
Yeah.
I feel more safe inside of my house, not outside.
And when you come here, do you feel safe?
Yeah, I just can have a nice time without having many worries about anything bad happening.
But there are no simple answers to this complex issue.
Why are you driving around with a knife like that?
Don't know.
You're carrying it, why?
Don't know, mate. So I'm not the odd one out, maybe.
So why carry it?
I'm into knives, innit? I like the way they're looking at.
Weapons are seized, arrests follow. This 16-year-old for possessing a knife. So too the 18-year-old who was driving without a licence or insurance. Their fate is still to be determined. And the bereaved also want answers.
I miss him. I miss his hugs. I miss like his laughter. You know, I miss. I miss dancing with him.
Eddie's story sums up this city's challenge, but knife crime and its impact reaches further, and it needs much wider solutions. Dan Johnson, BBC News, Bristol.
Train drivers on LNER, which operates rail services on the East Coast Main Line between London and Edinburgh, are to stage a series of fresh strikes every weekend from the end of August to November. This dispute is separate from the long-running row over pay, which looks like being resolved after a new offer this week from the government. LNER said it was surprised and disappointed by the announcement following recent talks. Well, our transport correspondent Katie Austin is here with me. So why are they striking, Katie?
Well, the union says this is about a breakdown of industrial relations at LNER. It's accused management of bullying and breaking agreements, for example, over rosters. As you say, it is separate to that wider drivers' pay dispute, which could soon be settled if drivers accept a pay offer that was put on the table just this week. But these 3 months of weekend strikes just announced today specifically affect LNER, which is actually one of the publicly controlled operators, and it will upset a lot of people's travel plans if it goes ahead. LNER, for its part, as you say, has expressed surprise and disappointment. It also said it took any accusations of bullying very seriously and didn't tolerate it. If we think back to the wider pay dispute for a minute, though, so not to do with these strikes, well, that deal that ASLEF was offered this week was notable because it wasn't conditional on changes to working practices the previous government had said were necessary, while the RMT union, which represents lots of other rail workers, is due to have pay talks next week, and its General Secretary Mick Lynch has made it clear that he is expecting a similar offer, similar terms to ASLEF's deal.
Thank you, Katie. And Paddy O'Connell will have more on those strikes on Newsnight on BBC Two shortly.
Yes, hello. Those strike-busting pay deals. Is the new Labour government caving into the unions or clearing up after austerity? And the 100 best-selling books of the last 50 years, how many have you read? Newsnight is at 10:30 on BBC Two, on BBC News and on iPlayer.
Thank you very much, Paddy. The new Premier League season kicked off this evening as Manchester United beat Fulham 1-0 at Old Trafford. Tomorrow, Ipswich will start their first season back in the top flight after more than 20 years. And Manchester City will be looking to win an unprecedented 5th league title in a row. But as Nesta McGregor reports, matters off the pitch could cast a shadow over the action on it.
Manchester City, champions again!
A familiar sight come next May. Will it be 5 in a row for Pep Guardiola's team? Or runners-up the past 2 years for Arsenal? Could it be third time lucky?
And it's an Arsenal goal!
For me, if they get a top-class forward into their squad, then I think that would be enough to take them over the line. And I think if they can do that, then that's why I would say Arsenal can definitely win the league.
Meanwhile, Ipswich Town's resurgence is a remarkable one. Back in the English top flight for the first time in 22 years. After sponsoring their kit, their most famous fan, Ed Sheeran, went a step further, buying a stake in the club. And the action in the boardrooms is increasingly being as talked about as the action on the pitch. Manchester City may well be enjoying the most successful period in their history, but at an upcoming hearing, they'll face 115 charges of breaking the Premier League's financial rules. Now, the club denies any wrongdoing, but possible punishments could include a transfer ban, points deductions, or even relegation. Last season, Everton and Nottingham Forest were deducted points for breaching profit and sustainability rules. Now, these relatively new regulations have seen clubs develop differing approaches in the transfer market. It's a balancing act. The Premier League want a competitive product without clubs spending beyond their means.
Well, we have a fantastic football competition. We have a big, thick rule book, and part of any sporting competition is a commitment, a central commitment to uphold those rules.
Ahead of the new season, controversial, but VAR is here to stay, as voted by the clubs. Although fans can expect more replays of incidents and live updates via social media, automated offsides are also set to be introduced for the first time. An influx of new players and plenty of managerial changes too. Brighton, Chelsea and Liverpool among them, with Arne Slot replacing Jurgen Klopp, who'd spent 8.5 years at Anfield. 20 sets of fans, differing expectations, but if there was ever a reminder to dream, Leicester City back in the Premier League after a year away. Who could forget when they defied the odds, the critics and the pundits to claim the title in 2016? Nesta McGregor, BBC News.
This programme continues on BBC One.
Whether you're in Washington, Wisconsin, or even back in the UK,
we take you behind the scenes, explaining US news, culture, and the era-defining presidential election.
Americast, a BBC News podcast untangling America. Listen on BBC Sounds.
Caving into the unions, Labour critics are circling those NHS and rail pay deals to end the strikes and waiting for Sue Gray to win or lose a Downing Street power struggle. Are those rumours true? Hello, welcome to Newsnight with insight and interviews. Tonight, strike-busting public sector pay deals are emerging as a new government policy. The Conservatives were criticised for not getting round the table, but now Labour's accused of caving in. Train drivers are being offered up to 5% backdated to 2019 with another deal as well. Junior doctors will vote on a deal worth 22% over 2 years. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has said settling disputes left from the Tory days will save the nation billions and boost growth. But who's going to pay? Our guests with political hawkeyes are Stephen Bush, Ava Santina-Evans and Joe Tanner. Dave Penman is with me. He's General Secretary of the FDA, the trade union for civil servants. Dave, nice to see you.
Good evening.
It feels like night and day to me, the policy of the Conservative government a couple of months ago and the policy of the Labour Party now.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think they've come in with an agenda to try and draw a line under these disputes, to settle them. They've been crippling many of our essential public services. That most of those disputes, you know, have been not only running for several months or years, but they were a long time in the making because of the problems around austerity, long-term issues over pay, as well as the problems of inflation.
So on inflation, you could have had an inflation deal, but there's been an inflation plus deal. Are you surprised at that?
Well, most of those deals were done as a result of evidence from peer review bodies. The point of peer review bodies is to take evidence from the government, evidence from the unions, and to look at the issues that are challenging those bits of the public sector.
Deal, about 5%.
About 5%, and that's what the peer review body recommended.
Did you suspect it might be less?
Well, it was going to be a tough choice for Labour because they were only a few weeks in government. All these pay deals come at a cost. Inevitably, when you govern, you have to choose, and there are a lot of people with a cheque that they want Labour to write. I think they sent a signal to public servants that they would honour the independent evidence from peer review bodies, and I think that's a good signal. If you want to improve public services, you need to be able to recruit and retain public servants.
You just used the phrase to governors to choose. Here is a choice. They took about 10 million pensioners off universal winter fuel payments. Age UK has said that's infuriated pensioners, many of whom have written to them saying they've been given a lower priority as pensioners than the disputes and settling the strikers.
Well, that's the choices that government have got to make. They've got to work...
So you accept that comparison?
Well, it's not just that. I mean, any government...
No, but you accept the comparison. Pensioners, no. Strikers, yes.
Well, that's not the choice.
Well, it is. You said that government is to choose.
Yeah, but
that is the choice they've made.
That's not the only choices. Government spends money on everything that we deal with, whether it's roads, NHS, teaching, defence. There are lots of choices that they've got to make. It's not simply one pot for public servants and one pot for pensioners. Government have to work out, and this government have made their political choices of what they think is important and drawn a line over long-term disputes that were crippling public services, many of those that pensioners rely on, and making sure that we can recruit and retain key public servants, I think has been one of their significant aims when they entered government.
So if you look at the contagion and the mission creep, Mick Lynch has already said he wants a deal matching the ASLEF deal. So we can say that paying off one, you need to pay off the other.
Well, he says that. The government will need to decide whether he's got a legitimate claim and whether they want to satisfy that.
He's implying he won't end his strike unless they match a synchronised deal.
That's a matter for Mick and the IMT.
But you can see my point, that there's mission creep in paying off strikers.
It's not about mission creep. It's about understanding that if you want public services to operate, if you want trains to run, if you want hospitals to work, if you want teachers to teach children, then you have to recruit and retain the talent that you've got in public services. And what's been happening for more than a decade is pay has been suppressed for those key bits of the workforce. So dealing with that is what Labour have started to do. You know, there are lots of long-term issues that have to be addressed. This is only one pay round in one summer, post the year of record inflation. What their approach is over the longer term, I think, will be more interesting than what they've done in this one pay round.
Well, here's another kicker. ASLEF are going on strike after they were offered this pay deal. There's a strike on LNER.
Well, I'm sure they've got a reason to do that.
Well, I thought you're saying this is to draw a line under Tory austerity. So they've drawn the line and then there's another strike.
But there's a whole host of areas of the public sector and public services that Labour have been trying to settle. The train disputes and individual disputes in trains are only one aspect of that. If you look at what they've done in terms of teaching and NHS, the signal they've given to public servants, what they've done is they've listened to the evidence about what do you need. If you want teachers to teach, if you want nurses to look after people, what do you need to do to be able to recruit and retain them? And the delays that we've seen, whether it's on trains or whether it's in hospitals or the problems in schools, are only solved if you've got public servants working in them. And that, I think, has been the change of approach, the night and day that you talked about from what we've seen over the last few weeks.
Dave, thank you very much for addressing this with us. We'd like to ask you to stay because you know Sue Gray very well indeed. She was probably in your union at one time. So we'd very much like you to stay with us. Thank you very much. Let's go to our panel now. Stephen Bush, who is Associate Editor at the Financial Times, Ava Santina Evans, Correspondent at Politics Joe, and Joe Tanner, the strategist who was Political Advisor to Boris Johnson. Thank you all for coming. Joe, is this a victory for the unions?
I think it's possibly a PR disaster for ASLEF to sort of pick this fight so early, to have, the pay deal done and then to come out with this second sort of issue or action, this action that they've called. I'm not sure I'd want to cross Louise Hay, the new Secretary of State for Transport, so fast. I think it's going to be interesting as to whether this is something that then I think it feels a bit like they've pulled the rug quite quickly.
So
because people were still reeling from the deal and still, absorbing that, and then suddenly this action's been called, and I'm not sure it's a smart move on their part.
Right, so in other words, the second strike I was talking about with Dave, that's a PR catastrophe for ASLEF.
I think it's really risky for them.
Stephen, what about this line, it's a choice, pensioners no, strikers yes?
Well, look, there's some truth in some of the spending decisions, but we shouldn't forget that the triple lock, when it goes up next year, will benefit pensioners by much, much more than the wealthiest pensioners will lose when the winter fuel allowance comes in. And the winter fuel allowance, when it was introduced by Gordon Brown, was introduced at a time when most pensioners were in poverty. Now pensioners are the richest demographic in the United Kingdom. So I think it's, and ultimately we shouldn't also forget that, quite rightly, pensioners are the main beneficiaries of us ending the retention crisis in the NHS, because public service usage is U-shaped, broadly speaking. It's used by the very young and the very old. But the political economy of this is that the wealthiest pensioners didn't vote Labour last time. They're unlikely to vote Labour next time. And I suspect that when we see that budget, which will, of course, be full of lots of very difficult choices, to use Rachel Reeves's preferred phrase, there will be new taxes on the wealthiest pensioners in order to keep her promise not to tax working people, i.e. the people who voted Labour at this election and who they hope will keep voting for them in the future.
Ava, is it good politics to pay off strikers?
I think that it has been reported as if it is bad politics, because it sort of looks like Labour are kowtowing to the unions, when actually this is rather pragmatic. Because if you look at how expensive a strike is for the country, for example, if you look back at the teachers' strike, or the potential teachers' strike that would have occurred later this year had the Education Secretary not reached a potential pay deal with the National Education Union, the cost of actually paying those teachers is cheaper, the pay rise, than those teachers going on strike eventually. And that's exactly the same situation that you have with the trains.
That's the Rachel Reeves argument in a nutshell, isn't it? All of this is costing so much.
Well, she needs growth, right? You don't get growth if you've not got people getting to work, because there's no trains taking them.
Yeah, and look, what was one of the central reasons why the Conservatives lost the election? It was the sense that nothing worked. 8% of people waiting for an NHS procedure, people, schools. So tackling those crises is a key part of how they're going to get re-elected.
Now, what about that? As a former advisor to Boris Johnson, the argument made here is that we've come in as Labour to clear up your nasty austerity. You bombed us back to the Stone Age in the public services, say the critics. Do you think the Tory record on austerity will haunt them, that they ran things into the ground, and this is what Labour is going to be saying?
Well, I think it's already haunted them to some extent. I think when you look at, whenever anyone mentioned George Osborne, that was the first thing that was said. It was very little about a lot else that he did. And I think for the Tories, the narrative has been very much set, which is, everything was broken under you guys. We've now got to come and sort of unpack it. It's like buying a house that's you found out the roof's caving in. That's essentially the narrative they've gone. How long that lasts is another question.
Ava, do you...
Well, I was just going to say, it's not even just about austerity. One of the big problems that we've had over the past 10 years, particularly with the rail, is privatisation. And, if you look during the pandemic, we were giving billions and billions of pounds to these rail companies in order to keep them afloat. At the same time, these rail companies were actually giving £35 million to their shareholders. So the headlines today and the headlines tomorrow that will inevitably come out are that actually it's too expensive to pay the workers, which is almost a redundant argument because it's an absolute fraction. It's about a tenth of what we gave them during the pandemic.
And finally, contagion. Do you think that more pay deals will go up?
No, I think ultimately the thing which sets the metric of a pay deal is, can that particular workforce afford to strike? That's why the rail unions always get a good deal. And is the government struggling to recruit the workers it needs? And that's why the big pay battles are going to be, yes, with teachers and with train drivers, but also in jobs where people can't afford to strike, but where the government is really struggling to recruit people, like the care sector.
Yes, well, the care sector also, they're the people who can't go on strike.
Exactly.
It's not fair, it's not a level playing field.
And they're the people who've not been talked about. They're the bit of the NHS that no one has covered, apart from dear old Ed Davey, who was trying to raise it during the election. But actually, they just get left, and yet day in, day out, they know that if they were not to turn up for work, they know the names, they know the faces of the people that would be suffering, and they just don't do it.
And also remember that, during the last administration, their right to bring their families here was also taken away from them. So a lot of them are now here on very poor pay, unable to strike, and they're also not with their families. OK, well, we're underway. It's very nice of you to come, and we want you to be with us to talk about our next subject when Dave will join us again. So we'll see you in a second. A number 10 power struggle is making headlines again.
Totally predictable rumours of a Downing Street firework party involving Sue Gray have made it into the papers just weeks into the new administration. She is the former Partygate panjandrum, said by some to be the most powerful woman in Britain. We've found a rare television interview with her. As far as we know, it's the only one she ever did. The highly rated civil servant, who came from a working-class background, ran a pub in Northern Ireland before becoming permanent secretary of the Department of Finance there, but was then passed over for the top job. And that's how she came to speak to the BBC Belfast political correspondent Gareth Gordon in 2021.
Not everybody gets this kind of treatment.
Really?
You're a bit of a mystery. I mean, I'm just going to read out some of the titles that I've heard applied to you. Deputy God, that's a good one. The most powerful civil servant you've never heard of, or the most powerful woman in Britain. Do you recognise those titles?
They obviously relate to my former job. The Deputy God title was that I worked for Gus O'Donnell, and his initials are God. And so I was his deputy, and therefore I was Deputy God. Most powerful person you've never heard of, I actually was just doing my job, and I think that was some of your journalist colleagues probably actually devised that.
But I suppose the mystery around you, this is the first interview you've ever done. You were the Director General of the Propriety and Ethics team at the Cabinet, and it said you did have the power to make or break political careers, and that is exactly what you did.
So I would always have just given my advice to the Prime Minister, and it was obviously always the Prime Minister's decision. But the job I was doing then was very different to the job I do now, and I don't necessarily recognise all that you're saying about me. I'm not actually sure many permanent secretaries in Whitehall have run a pub in Newry.
And you were with your husband in that venture, of course.
And he was not very good at it.
He wasn't?
No. So he hated the pub. And actually most of the customers didn't like him either because he was quite miserable in it. He, after 6 to 8 weeks, it was making him a bit fed up. So I sent him back to London, and I carried on running the bar on my own. Whenever he was back, when he would come back for a short time, I would make sure that I booked him to sing and play music in the bar on a Thursday and Saturday night. And that went down quite well. But as for his bar skills, they're not the best. I think I felt I was being a bit pigeonholed in Whitehall in a particular role. So I thought, do something very, very different, and that's what I did. I did go for the head of the civil service job, and I really wanted that job. So I'm going to be completely honest, I was disappointed not to get the job. I really wanted the job, but had to get over it. Why didn't I get the job? I'm not sure I'll ever quite know, but I suspect people may have thought that I am perhaps too much of a challenger or a disruptor. I am both. And perhaps I would bring about, there's going to be too much change. And yes, I wanted to have change.
Did you think, you obviously thought the civil service needed change?
Yeah, and it needed change.
I've even had someone put it to me that you are a spy.
I know you've had that put to you. I think if I was a spy, I'd be a pretty poor spy if people are talking about me being a spy.
Well, electric here on the sofa. Ava, a shout out to journalists outside the London bubble who get scoops.
Yes, I mean, it was an extraordinary interview, wasn't it? And perhaps maybe why Sue Gray hasn't done an interview subsequently. I think she gave a bit much away there.
I just wonder if Keir Starmer knows that that's how she treated her husband. I wonder what's in store for him.
Stephen, before we get into whether there's a power struggle, are there briefings to the press that there are power struggles?
Yes. Yes, there are briefings, and I think a power struggle is putting it a little too strongly. But the thing which is fascinating about Keir Starmer, for those of us who cover this stuff, is that this is someone who is a very experienced public sector bureaucrat who really knows what he thinks when it comes to criminal justice, but whose broad politics are slightly more half-formed, who's picked someone who, like him, is deeply steeped in how Whitehall and institutions work, who also, her politics aren't wholly clear. And so there's a lot of anxiety at the top of the Labour Party where people go, I don't really know what Downing Street wants of me, or I don't quite understand what the politics of what we're doing are.
But the power struggle is said to be with Morgan McSweeney, who was going to be the politics guy, and she was going to be the chief of staff. It was always going to be this transition sort of tension, but the briefings say she's been moving his desk further away from the Prime Minister, Jo.
Yeah, and there was also a sort of, there's been a little bit of counter-briefing to that, suggesting that the office that was chosen was not suitable for the team, and it meant that he was then moving back accordingly. You know, you never quite know with this stuff, but there is no question that there is something going on, because they've only been there a few weeks. Normally, most people are still working out, you know, where's the best place to get a sandwich and you know, where the toilets are. And they're clearly already starting to have this sense of whose job is whose, you know, even who was appointed by who. The Prime Minister was not the one ringing up people. Jess Phillips talked about, has spoken openly, how she was stood in the rain and got a phone call from Sue Gray, which is not the way things are normally done.
Dave, you know her. Do you recognise this tension?
Well, no. I mean, what I know about Sue is that she's a really effective civil servant, and she was brought in by Labour planning for running government. You know, if you think about what the country's faced over the last few weeks with the riots and the challenges facing there, Sue was at the heart of pulling government together on that. I think most people would say if they want government to respond to that kind of situation, you'd want someone like Sue Gray at the heart of it. Now, any new administration, particularly one coming from so many years in opposition, is going to take time to find its feet. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a little bit of that. Different roles, lots of people who were working for Labour perhaps not getting roles in government because civil servants take on those roles. And those things will just take time to settle down.
So it's classic rivalry, you're saying. This is bound to happen, but with people whose roles are being sorted out. But just on this question that Jo raises, have a listen to this. This is Jess Phillips on her podcast, Electoral Dysfunction.
So I was stood in the street in central London. It was absolutely chucking it down. And I was waiting for an Uber. So I was looking at my phone and Sue Gray called me. So I answered the phone. I was like, oh, hi, Sue, how are you? And we had a little bit of conversation about the election and stuff. And then she said, anyway, Jess, I just want to say, do you want to come back into government?
Well, that's, Ava, that's Sue offering her the job.
Yeah, well, it sounds rather positive, but it also tallies with the briefings.
Well, it sounds rather like more mission creep. The Prime Minister's meant to do...
It's mission-led, remember. It's mission-led, not mission creep.
No, but that's meant to be the Prime Minister's patronage, not Sue Gray's patronage.
Yes, it tallies with these briefings that there is a sort of bottleneck with Sue Gray, that every decision and every ministerial position has to go through her, which is actually something that Downing Street have denied. But, I mean, that does lend itself to it.
So I would say I have never known there to be a orthodox way of appointing junior ministers. I feel that every government transition I've covered, both within the Conservative Party and now with the Labour Party, there's been someone going, oh, that was a bit weird. I mean, I remember actually in 2015 on a Labour transition, as it was happened, I was taking a Labour contact out to dinner and they were bemoaning the fate of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn when their phone went off and it was the Chief Whip's office asking them if they would take a shadow ministerial job. So I think there's always... Yeah, it's very rare that there's the recognised procedure for that.
I mean, ultimately, what you saw there wasn't Sue Gray offering Jess Phillips a job. It was the Prime Minister offering Jess Phillips a job.
Because she speaks for him.
That's what she does. She's his key special advisor, and special advisors only operate with the authority of the Minister, or in this case, the Prime Minister, that's doing. And for someone who's doing a Chief of Staff role, that's going to cover any number of issues. And there's a key relationship there, the trust between the Prime Minister and the Chief of Staff.
And this is the woman who knows everything. This is the one person out of everyone who's in Downing Street who knows where everything is. She's been there, you know, for many years before, so she knows her way around. So to some extent, you can imagine it being a sense of sort of not taking over, but a degree of that. I think the issue is they've got to sort it out quite fast because it's not a good look. And the things I've heard from other people that know Keir very well say it's not the PM's kind of style. He doesn't actually like this kind of personality stuff playing out.
And also, access to the Prime Minister's time is power. And if she is the Chief of Staff, we've been rehearsing this argument with, I don't know, were you friends with Dominic Cummings? We used to say
I'd worked with him a long time ago, yeah. But and actually it didn't work particularly well, did it, with his approach?
Well, I'm just wondering, is this a timeless script? Are we just rehashing something? The media loves a power struggle in number 10, the TBGBs, but access to the Prime Minister has always been a closely guarded commodity.
And all of those advisers are going to be tussling for the Prime Minister's time. I mean, there's still this fight at the moment from the transition from, working for the Labour Party to working in number 10, particularly among, many advisers that haven't quite made the cut yet and haven't had their appointments.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, being in opposition, and lots of people have access to Keir as leader of the opposition, is very different from being in government and the Prime Minister. One of the key jobs that Sugri has got as Chief of Staff,
I know what you're going to say,
is controlling the access.
Gatekeeper. She's a gatekeeper. So sometimes a gatekeeper says no. So
but it doesn't always work. Gatekeepers under Theresa May, remember, it was reported that people put box notes in, the box that the Prime Minister used to get, and they would take them back out. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. The PM is supposed to get access to stuff, to make decisions of their own, not always their Chief of Staff to do that for them.
Ava, should I be at all concerned that there's something about a working class woman who achieves great heights being knocked on the telly?
Yeah, well, I suppose unfairly. I think that she has, had a name made for herself without really her doing during the Boris Johnson administration. So perhaps I think, she's sort of being thrown out again to public, consumption.
But on that, if there is a fight between Morgan McSweeney and Sue Gray, she wins already on profile. The people in the street don't know who he is, and many more people know who she is.
Well,
she's won.
There have been quite a lot of chiefs of staff under Keir Starmer who've tussled with Morgan McSweeney, and he's still there. I would say the story of the story of Labour Party politics under Keir Starmer has mostly been Morgan always wins, both internally and indeed, I suppose, externally in the most recent election. But look, where this is actually a story of real impact is that what it comes down to is an anxiety across the top of the Labour Party that they don't necessarily know when someone says Downing Street wants X. Does that mean Keir Starmer wants X? Does that mean that the relevant aide they're talking to wants X? Does it mean that the departmental minister is ventriloquising Downing Street and hoping that they will get their way? Does it mean Rachel Reeves wants X? And that is the thing which is going to have to be decided, is actually who does speak for the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister can't do all of that stuff for themselves.
And don't forget, it's silly season, right? Silly season is the summer. There's a lot of this stuff goes on. It might start to calm down.
But whatever we say, what an amazing interview we just saw from Northern Ireland.
Fantastic. And her poor husband.
Right. Lovers of lists are licking their lips over the 100 best-selling books of the last 50 years. Compiled by the Sunday Times, the chart is a nostalgic rummage through the nation's shelves. Life on Earth by David Attenborough is on there, along with The World According to Clarkson by you-know-who, Writing Home by Alan Bennett, Bill Bryson's The Lost Continent and Notes from a Small Island, Captain Corelli's Mandolin by Louis de Bernier, and many more. In fact, up to 100, being as it is a list of 100. How many on the list did you read?
I'm ashamed to say I've actually got some of them that I've never read. I think I've just got them on a bookshelf. But I was actually really pleased to see Adrian Mole. That sort of took me back to my childhood.
It is nostalgic for some of us, because The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole came out when I was about the age of the boys, 13 and 3/4, can't even remember now. But what does it tell us about ourselves, Stephen, this list? You've seen it all.
I think it tells us two things. One, it tells us things that we genuinely value and bring us together, like Delia Smith has 3 entries on there. But it also tells us things about our vanity. I mean, the top most selling book, and this is A Brief History of Time, which I think is probably one of the most bought books, but not, it has to be said, one of the most read books.
You know my life, because it was so brief, I didn't get past page number 2 of The Brief History of Time. How many have you read on the list?
Do you know, the 3 Delia Smiths were they were always in our kitchen, and God bless my mum, I don't think she ever opened them. But they were a nice ornament in the kitchen.
Well, that's a shame, because, I mean, her carrot soup recipe is an absolute essential, and I can't. You need to tell your family to read again.
Have you made it several times?
Well, absolutely. Where are you on the books on the list? There's Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus.
Yeah, I think I got halfway. Yeah, I get about halfway through that. I like Captain Corelli's Mandolin. I was in Kefalonia on Wednesday, reminiscing about that book kind of stuff. I think there's probably about a dozen on that I can recall kind of reading. So I like the eclectic mix of it. A little book of calm from cooking books, and then some of the stuff like the Bill Bryson stuff, which is a kind of view of Brits from a foreigner kind of stuff, is quite nice as well.
Yes, it does show a great warmth and a sort of sense of humour. But what's missing? Are your favourite authors missing?
I was surprised. E.L. James wasn't on there. The 50 Shades sort of trilogy that took sort of the world by storm.
It's all we ever talked about.
Well, it did
for
seem
about
to
a
be,
year
yeah,
and
that didn't appear. And I actually thought, I'm going to sort of sound like I've got a bit of a theme here, but Judy Blume was another big author that for many sort of youngsters seemed to be the book that everybody read as a teenager, and I didn't see that there either.
And for you, Ava, when you think of the books that we're looking at, is there a sort of common denominator? Have we changed our habits? Because if you look at Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, that sort of seems a bit outdated now, the idea that you can explain away all of your relationship worries by wondering whether or not you and I will see life differently. I want to retreat to my man cave, I think the book says, and you want to see more regular signs of affection.
Sure, but actually a book that was on there, which was, I forget the full title, but it's Eleanor Oliphant, I believe, is Not Okay. That was the first book, actually, that properly exploded on social media. And actually the themes of that are exactly the same themes as Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. It's all about how do you understand each other from different genders.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is there are some perennial themes there. There's a lot of self-help. So there's 12 Rules for Life, there's Men Are From Mars. There's a lot of big books about the universe, like Thinking Fast and Incredibly Slow or A Brief History of Time. And there's a lot of stuff about fiction which speaks to our kind of deepest sense about what it means to be human, even in the case of, say, Watership Down, which technically it's about rabbits, but it's really about loyalty and fraternity and friendship and death. And I think it speaks to what reading can give us, which is an access to a wider world and open new perspectives and whatnot.
Sure.
Yeah, I think I was really surprised that Rosemary Connolly was on there. And I again, another one of those books that became a bit of a phenomenon about, people jumping around in their living rooms and different sort of exercises people could do, but also thinking about what they were eating. At the same time, in that same list, you saw Delia Smith and many of her, well, as you say, the carrot soup, but, quite a lot that she has put together that have probably taken up lots of people's kitchen shelves.
Yeah, it's the nostalgia is all over it. When I saw the cover of the Watership Down book, it took me back to being about 10. It's the actual one that I actually read. It's that copy, and there was a great sort of feeling of warmth about this list.
Yeah, just looking at it there, McCarthy's Bar. I enjoyed Peter McCarthy was a great travel writer, and there's quite a lot of travel. There's quite a lot of perspective on the world around us, and of course there's a book called A Man Named Dave. Why would that not be top of the list?
You've invented a whole new sort of political interview, I think, where you should talk about books. More politicians and union leaders should talk about their book taste. It'd be great. Thanks very much indeed. I'm going to scamper through the papers, and maybe if I get through it quickly enough, you can comment on the front pages. I think you predicted them for us earlier. Let's have a little look. Here's the Times. Strike pain for travellers despite big wage rises. That's the front page of the Times there. You can see as we push in, as predicted by our panel. From the Eye, weekend section. GPs tell Labour no end to 8 a.m. appointments turmoil without extra funding. 9 million people forced to wait longer than a week to see their GP. And has Labour lost control of the unions already, from the Daily Mail? Dave, what's the answer to that?
They don't control the unions. They never did, so I don't think that really counts.
You're not buying your Daily Mail tomorrow, I don't think. Then we've also got The Independent here. More rail strikes despite drivers' bumper pay deal. Ava, this is exactly what you predicted was going to be the papers were going to be saying.
Well, I had my crystal ball and I'd been phoning into the editors to make sure.
More rail strikes despite the bumpers pay deal.
Yeah, I think the GP one is actually really interesting because health has been the bit that we know needs to be solved, hasn't been talked enough, was not talked about anywhere near enough during the election, and we know that the GP issue is getting worse and is going to continue to get worse with the BMA's view on what they're going to do next.
Back to the papers. There's one of the papers that is making its own way with its front page is the Daily Telegraph. Can we have a little look at that? Have a look at the Telegraph. We made mistakes. There we are. I've seen that one. Can we go to scamper to the Telegraph? There we are. We made mistakes over Letby, admits CPS. Vital evidence that showed which nurses could have been on the ward was incorrect. So I think we'll leave you there. That's the look at the papers. That's it for this week. Adam Fleming is back on Monday, thank heavens. Till then, have a good weekend. Good night.
Live from London, this is BBC News. Kyiv releases images from the start of its offensive 11 days ago, an attack on a Russian border checkpoint. 2 men who took part in riots in England received the longest sentences yet. One gets nearly 5 years, the other 6. And victims of the infected blood scandal will get compensation payments by the end of the year, more than £2 million for some. Hello, I'm Kylie Pentelow. Welcome to the programme. We begin in Russia, where Ukraine has destroyed a strategic bridge in the Kursk region, cutting a supply route as it continues its incursion into Russian territory. Kyiv says the aim of its offensive is to force Moscow to start what it calls fair peace talks. Meanwhile, Russia has summoned Italy's ambassador in Moscow over a team of Italian journalists who reported from Ukrainian-held parts of Russia this week, calling it an illegal border crossing. Our Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse has the story.
Ukraine isn't just targeting Russian troops, but their supply lines too. A missile makes light work of a major bridge in Russia's Kursk region. It was a counter-offensive which surprised just about everyone, apart from the Ukrainian paratroopers